So I'm Mike, hi. I do a lot at a school called the Cooper Union. I'm also a graphic designer. I was the acting dean of the Cooper Union, and now I like to joke that I'm the real dean. I've been an associate professor since 2001. I was a former faculty observer, which meant that I had to keep eyes on the board of trustees, which will make sense in a little while. I formed the Committee to Save Cooper Union, and I own the world's largest Mr. T memorabilia collection, which our book will be out in December, and it's called I Pity the Dolls, but I will not be talking about that today. What I will be talking about is that I am a Batman nerd. Woo! Especially the 1966 Batman live action series. I grew up watching this show with Adam West and Burt Ward, and it was like a religion to me. I watched it every single day. And when it was on in prime time in the 60s, it aired twice a week, if you can imagine, right? There's no show right now that airs twice a week. And in syndication, they would air them back to back, so a half hour and then another half hour. And they did that every day of the week when I was a kid. And again, I watched it every day, and every time they did that, there was a cliffhanger between the two episodes. And in between the cliffhanger, they would say, same bat time, same bat channel. So let's watch.
I guarantee this machine is fair, so let the game commence.
Horrors, 1 lemon. Double horrors, 2 lemons. And if it's a third, instant and inescapable, 50,000 volts. Close your eyes. Who dares to see it? Try us tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Wow. I watched every day. I couldn't help myself. I started buying Batman toys. I had Batman Matchbox cars. I could not stop, right? And it put me on a path to really just appreciate and buy comics. And I wonder, was Batman even first, right? I might have seen Max Fleischer's Superman first. The first comic book I probably saw was Bazooka Joe Bubblegum. But I've been a Batman fan for a long time. That's me. And what did I like about Batman? It was designed. Look at this logo. Look at the lettering in the credits. Look at the henchmen. It literally says henchmen on their t-shirts. Yak and Boff, Goon. All the fight scenes were famously lettered. Powie, Awk, Crunch, Boff, right? I fell in love with Batman. So much so that I started collecting Batman comics. I'm from a small town in Abington, Pennsylvania. This is the high school that I went to. And there was only one comic book store in our area, and it was actually called the Comic Book Store. And this was my boss. And George, my boss, he was a funny guy. He kind of hated money. He was one of these guys, if you brought a bunch of comics to the register, he'd be like, you don't want to read these. You should read these good comics instead. So he took it upon himself to educate me. And the joke I like to make is that I walked into the comic book store listening to Madonna, and I walked out listening to Metallica. And I got into everything there. We had Wacky Packs there, which were these small sticker cars from the 70s. Who knows Wacky Packs? I'm curious. A few people, okay. My favorite Wacky Pack was the one that was the Logs logo. Famously, there were these pantyhose called Legs, and they made these ridiculous things called Logs. I got really into Mad Magazine, and more importantly, I got into comic books history, right? So this is the first appearance of Batman in Detective Comics 27. And specifically, these two comics, they're very well known, really changed how I looked at comics and appreciated comics. And these comics are The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller and Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And the reason, look, I love Batman, The Dark Knight Returns for a few reasons, but the biggest reason is that I grew up hating Superman. I'm not a fan of Superman, and in this comic, Batman destroys Superman, and in my opinion, becomes the mightiest hero there is. He, even to this day, outsells Superman, so let's just say he's the best, okay? And inside Dark Knight was this group called the Sons of Batman, or the SOBs for short. I fell in love with these guys to the point where I made my first logo. So I put that on a t-shirt. You could get a t-shirt if you answered all the questions for my fan club. I was the only member. There was one t-shirt. And Watchmen I fell in love with because of the craft, the way it's rendered, the way it's conceived. And what was amazing about Watchmen, or at least one of my takeaways, was there's an issue called Fearful Symmetry, where the artist of the comic book uses the same panel structure from the beginning. Once you hit the middle, he flips it over and uses the mirror image of the panels going forward, which is just a beautiful touch about a comic book about symmetry. And the main theme of The Watchmen is who makes the world, which really for me triggered who makes these comics, where do they come from, who are the people behind them. That's what I got really interested in. And embarrassingly, I also got into The Punisher. Show of hands, who knows The Punisher? He's a little more famous. Okay, good. The best way I can describe The Punisher would be this, or how I like The Punisher. Right? I like angry comics that help me deal with the angers of life. The joke on The Punisher is that in a way his superhero or his super ability is that he can decide if you're guilty and then he can kill you. That is why I'm embarrassed to talk about it right now. And when I was a kid, I was so into that as a superpower, some ability to judge right from wrong. And my boss, George, said, well, you know, there's one comic where the Punisher shoots at civilians. And I was like, get out of here. That can't be true. He's like, no, it's an issue of Spectacular Spider-Man. So in this issue of Spectacular Spider-Man, Punisher shoots somebody for running a red light, and he shoots somebody for littering. And you're probably thinking, that's ridiculous. And you would be right. So ridiculous, in fact, that the next writer had to change that. Right? That writer had to say, oh, the Punisher was drugged. He didn't really mean to shoot those people, right? And what that exposed to me was, one, that writer of that comic didn't like the Punisher, and that was an act of commentary, right? He was saying he put the Punisher in this cartoon light to show how ridiculous he is. And it also introduced me to the sort of the minutia of comics, right? That continuity had to be reconciled, had to be worked with. And really, from that point forward, I was hooked. George also got me into a really terrible comic that actually changed my life. This comic is very bad. This is Marvel Comics Super Special #1 featuring the band Kiss. This artwork is okay, sure. But it had an incredible gimmick, this comic, which is they held a press conference where they drew their blood and added their blood to the ink of the printed comic. And my head exploded, right? Like, what is a printing plate? Is there really blood in this comic? I mean, I'm holding it in my hand. Is that really their blood? And I was so floored, I took this to my dad and said, do you have any Kiss records? He had one record. And in my opinion, that record is the greatest piece of graphic design in the universe, right? It's my opinion. Behold. This is Rock and Roll Over from 1976. And I was so infatuated with this graphic that I took it to my junior high school library and I said, what is this stuff, right? How do I make this stuff? And they had exactly one book in the library called Milton Glaser Graphic Design, which taught me a lot about graphic design. It showed me what it was, it showed me the different modes and the different styles it could be in, but it did not tell me how to make graphic design. So I bought this book at the local Walden Books to teach me how to make graphic design. So this predates a lot of you, I'm sure, but this book told me how to make mechanicals, how to cut up pieces of paper and glue them to a board and take a photograph of it so that a printer could use it on a plate. This book taught me how to do that. And so because of this book, I did the school newspaper, the school literary magazine. I had freelance graphic design jobs in high school. It's crazy. And as I got into design, there was this moment of how do I do that? How do I get there? So I really stopped collecting comics and got way more into design. And I had this big question. How do I pay for art school? Because I was super broke. So before I go to art school, there was a big comic book event. These are pretty common now, but back then they had just sort of gotten started. This one was called Death in the Family. And in this comic book, the Joker depicted here beats up Robin with a crowbar. And it ends on a cliffhanger. And the next page was this ad from DC Comics. And you could call a phone number to keep Robin alive or to kill him. I called to kill him. Okay, this is the cover of that comic, right? So what did I do? I went to every local supermarket. I had my mom drive me all over the place. I didn't know how to drive back then. I still don't, actually. I had my friends drive me all around. I bought about 100 issues of this comic. And the year before I went to art school, I got a dealer table at New York Comic Con and sold this comic. I sold a few other comics too, but I made about $12,000 in profit off this endeavor, and it paid for my first year of art school. Yeah, it's crazy. It could really covered all my first year expenses at art school, and this is where I ended up, the Cooper Union. And the Cooper Union was founded in 1859 to be free to everybody. So I received a full tuition scholarship to go to the Cooper Union, and that $12,000 paid for all my art supplies and my first year's living expenses. An incredible opportunity. And I get to Cooper Union, which is considered a very good art school, and I have one big question. Why you hate comics? Everybody at Cooper Union seemed to hate comics. None of my teachers wanted me to do anything with comics. Nobody had there was no audience for comic book work. It just wasn't in our history. It's not the place to go for that. And I didn't understand why. Comics helped me understand style. Look at all these depictions of Batman. Look at the range inside there. Comic books taught me this. Comic books taught me to love weird typography and weird lettering. Even my work today has a kinship with this kind of lettering now. Comics introduced me to my first characters wrestling with HIV or AIDS. And Cooper Union is specifically ridiculous because Matt Baker, one of the most well-known black comic book artists, who some consider made the first graphic novel, attended the Cooper Union. And our founder had his own comic, right? So what did I do when I graduated? Nothing with comics. I started a company called The Chopping Block. And, back then, all you needed was a pretty fast Mac and an ISDN modem, and you could start a web design firm. This is the first project I did that got any notoriety back then. This is the website for the band They Might Be Giants. And we went on to grow. So this is me with two of my friends at The Chopping Block. Every 6 months, we changed our website. So this is me, we added another person. This is when we were 5. So this is when we were NASA astronauts. This is when we were Cub Scouts. The final site I was involved with, we were orange farmers. This is me picking oranges. And that represents about 10 years of my life with no comics, right? None. And then I get this hilarious phone call. Do you know anything about Batman? Well, it turns out I do, quite a bit. So I have a meeting at DC Comics, and I land, this is the second book I ever designed, was The Art of Batman Begins. So we had a kickoff meeting with Chris Nolan, the director of the film. I got to work closely with DC Comics and the people who make the props and do all the production, and I'm just gonna run through my client work really quickly. Chapter openers. This is the second book I did for DC Comics. This is The Art of the Dark Knight. This one was really tricky because Heath Ledger died in the middle of making this, so it got put on hold and we removed all the images of Heath. It's a long, crazy process. Excuse me. And one funny thing is, you can barely see it here, but you see how my name is watermarked across every image? When you do a book like this, every single image looks like this until the very end. They actually don't switch the images out until it's at the printer. So imagine working in InDesign, which represents a low-resolution preview with an image that has this junk put on top of it, and you can welcome to the world of movie book design. It's not so fun. I also got to work on this Superman Returns book with Bryan Singer. I don't like Superman, so we're gonna go fast. And I had the pleasure of working on this CoverGirls book for DC Comics, which I'll show you now because it has a lot of Batman in it. So that's Robin, it's the intro, a whole section devoted to Gotham Girls, Catwoman. And some of you will appreciate this. My web design experience sometimes helps with the book design. So I got this project, and 2 other designers had quit because all the text was in an Excel file. So we laid this whole book out with JavaScript. So here's the cover, here's the opener, here's hello, it's Robin. And then here's the part we laid out with JavaScript. So there's basically an underlying grid, and the script knows where to put the images and where to associate the text, and then it also goes through and styles all the text. I also worked on the Sandman books. So I got to work with Neil Gaiman and Leslie Killinger, who was the author of these books. And these are also laid out with JavaScript. So they're very easy to see how that could work. So images on the left and right, a column of text, and then all the styling is done. And I'd like to point out that even when DC Comics gives me a Sandman book, it includes Batman. There's Batman in the upper right-hand corner. There's a sample of the text that shows how it's styled with JavaScript. And the last project I'll show is I got to work with Dave Gibbons on the Watchmen book. And this was, as you know, I mentioned earlier, I love the comic book, The Watchmen. And in this case, Dave Gibbons, the artist of The Watchmen, had a box of stuff left over that was in his closet. It actually said Watchmen stuff on the box. So we photographed all the stuff in that box and made this book called Watching the Watchmen. That's the case. That's the first end paper. So again, who makes the world? And I started to really fall in love again with the craft of Watchmen. Every time Rorschach appears, Dave Gibbons would do a blotter to make the ink in his mask look real. On the left is about 1.5 inch tall thumbnail that Dave drew, and on the right is the inked final with the color test that shows how close he was to that first thumbnail, right? Lots of sketching for Watchmen. That's the opening page. That's Dave on the right with Alan Moore on the left. Here's more of those thumbnails, just to show you the level of precision that Dave had. And one thing I talk about with this book was that it was my job to find the book. So this diagram you see here, I hadn't really understood what that was until I reread The Watchmen. And then I saw that was simply Dave plotting out the spin of a perfume bottle. This, I realized, was Dave plotting out how to walk up to a building, right? So on the right is a sketch of the entire building, and the red lines represent the panels on the left. And how did I do this and figure this out? I turned my copy of Watchmen into an index, right? So the red tabs are chapter breaks, the yellow tabs show where all the art was pulled from. Every yellow tab has a note from where I pulled it and why I took it out. And then that's the end-to-end paper, just to show that it always continues. Oh, one more project, sorry. I got to work with Superman's editor. So the guy getting pushed aside by Superman, that's Charlie Kochman. He was the editor of this Jerry Robinson book. He's the only real-life person I know that has appeared inside of a comic book, so I had to put him in my talk. So I got to work with Jerry Robinson, and Jerry's famous for inventing the Joker and inventing Robin, right? So 2 characters very close to me. He was the primary artist on a lot of the Batman work. That's Jerry on the left, the crankiest guy I've ever worked with. And Jerry owns some of the oldest surviving original Batman artwork, and I got to touch all of it, and I won't lie to you, I wept. Really, I sobbed. It was unbelievable to be in the room with this stuff. Some of Jerry's cover work. This is the card that Jerry used to pitch the Joker to DC Comics. One of the few appearances of the Joker where he's holding guns. Anyway, so that's the Jerry Robinson book. And like all comic book nerds, I have a podcast. That's me and Ed. And our biggest episode is Guardians of the Galaxy featuring Rocket Raccoon. And usually at this stage of the talk, somebody's wondering, why is he telling us all this? And I'm going to get there right now. So what have I been working on lately? Well, lately I've been working on Cooper Union. As I mentioned, I went to Cooper Union for free. 4 years paid for completely by the institution. Right? So for 155 years, Cooper Union was free. And in 2006, our trustees and our president spent all of our money on a building we did not need, and essentially put us in a hole about $10 million a year in debt. The new president decided to get us out of that hole. They were going to break with tradition and charge tuition for the first time. So we protested. The students occupied the 8th floor of our building. This was a protest outside with red streamers and balloons. And then there was an additional protest where the students occupied the president's office for 65 days. That's the longest student occupation in United States history, and I'd just like to give them a round of applause. And in my part, what I did was with two other friends of mine, a current student and a prospective student of the Cooper Union, we formed the Committee to Save Cooper Union. We raised over $400,000 from alumni. I built this website, and we filed a lawsuit in New York Supreme Court against the trustees of the school to keep it open and free. And what happens as a result of our lawsuit? Well, the Attorney General joined our lawsuit, and he told us that he thought Cooper Union should be free. And when the case settled, the Cooper Union president who decided to charge tuition was forced to resign, and the school reached a deal with the New York Attorney General's office. We won. Now we have a new president who's committed to go back to free, and they've now reinstated the full tuition, they're planning to reinstate the full tuition scholarship in 9 years. It's part of a 10-year plan to get back to free. We have exceeded all of the expectations of the plan and are on our way back. So, woo! Now, the whole time I did that, I've been fighting Cooper Union for 6 years. People who didn't understand why I was fighting would ask me this question: why do I fight? Well, now I'm going to tell you. That's me. I have Cooper Union's foundation building tattooed on my chest in case you think I'm not serious about all this. So now, why do I fight? So, Rocket Raccoon from Guardians of the Galaxy was invented by Bill Mantlo, who went to Cooper Union. Right? He also invented Cloak and Dagger, which you can catch on TV now, and he wrote the Punisher story that introduced me to retconning in comics. And if we're going to talk about the Punisher, the current Punisher logo, and the artwork for my podcast was done by Cooper Union graduate and my student, Victor Ochoa. Mad Magazine, maybe you've heard of it. The first issue of Mad Magazine and the first 23 issues of Mad Magazine were written by Harvey Kurtzman. He also introduced Alfred E. Neuman to the public. He attended Cooper Union. Those wacky packs I mentioned, those were made by Woody Gelman, who went to Cooper Union. He also invented Bazooka Joe and Mars Attacks, right? This Madonna record, this first record I listened to, that was designed by Karen Goldberg, who went to Cooper Union. This Metallica record, now Metallica, I put a patch of Metallica on my jacket in high school. That's how I met all my friends. That whole subculture, metalheads, that was me. Long hair, jean jacket, leather boots, I was that dirtbag in high school. All because of my love of Metallica, right? Turns out this cover features a typeface called Serif Gothic. Serif Gothic was also used in the logo for my high school and was invented by Herb Lubalin, who went to Cooper Union, which was based on the Legs logo he drew with Tom Carnese, which later appeared in Logs, the Wacky Packs, right? So if we cut back to Kill 'Em All, I got to see Metallica in a tiny club in New York 2 years ago because my student shot their current cover. So that's the current cover of Metallica, and this is my student Dimitri with Lars. The little middle finger in the middle of the photo, that's James Hetfield, just a heads up. And if we're going to talk about these two records, they were both released on vinyl. The vinyl record was invented by a Cooper Union graduate named Emil Berliner. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, didn't Thomas Edison invent the vinyl record? No, he invented the phonograph, but that's okay because he attended Cooper Union too. Right? That computer I had to be a web designer, well, all computers have microchips. I would imagine you all have a microchip in your pocket. You cannot create microchips without refined silicon, and you can't do that without an invention from William Gardner Pfan, a graduate of the Cooper Union. That ISDN modem I had to buy, that's based on a technology called T-carrier, right? So T-carrier was developed to basically to send digital signal over analog cables, right? Its first use was to send more information down the transatlantic and the transpacific cable, and then as a result of T-carrier, it also eliminated all the static on international calls, right? So this is the transatlantic cable when it was first laid, and I'll tell you, Peter Cooper, the founder of Cooper Union, was on the boat that laid the cable. So I like to joke that Cooper Union invented the internet. So now if we get back to my story, maybe I saw Max Fleischer's Superman first. Max Fleischer went to Cooper Union. He also invented rotoscoping and Betty Boop. And if we're going to talk about Superman, the Superman logo I grew up with right here and the DC Comics logo I grew up with were designed by Milton Glaser, who wrote the first book I ever read on graphic design. And if we're going to talk about the DC Comics logo, the current DC Comics logo was designed by Emily Oberman and her team. She went to Cooper Union. And if you want to see this logo, you could check out the new Wonder Woman movie because that was directed by Patty Jenkins, who went to Cooper Union. If we're going to talk about DC Comics, those two house ads that featured HIV and AIDS, characters dealing with HIV and AIDS, those were made by Neil Posner, who went to Cooper Union. And this book that taught me how to make graphic design, when I was interviewing at Cooper Union as a senior in high school, I went to the table and showed my portfolio. The guy said, "These are nice, but what else do you have?" I was like, "Oh, well, I have my school newspaper and my school literary magazine." He's like, "How did you learn to make these?" I said, "Oh, I read this book called The Graphic Designer's Production Handbook." And he says, "Oh, funny, I wrote that book. This is my first teacher. This is my offset lithography teacher from Cooper Union, Norman Sanders, who wrote that book." And now you're going to see where this is going. The record that inspired me to ask all these questions in the first place was designed by Michael Durrett, who went to Cooper Union. And Batman, the history of Batman, my hatred of Superman, paying my rent with all these books. Maybe my first true love is Batman. My first logo, my first memorable Halloween costume. We can sum it all up with this comic, right? So I sold this comic to pay for my first year at Cooper Union. It features a logo created by a Cooper Union graduate. It features the Joker and Robin, who were created by my clients, and Batman, my lifelong obsession, was co-created by Bob Kane, who went to Cooper Union. What? Now, if that's not enough, one more thing. Same bat time, same bat channel. I'm going to end where I began. So I saw this every day after school. That typeface is called Ad-lib. Ad-lib was designed by Freeman Krall, who went to Cooper Union. So now when I ask who makes the world, Cooper Union makes the world. Thank you.